Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and today, if you're watching the video, I have a very different background. I'm actually at work today doing this in one of my breaks, and I decided to do a at work podcast recording today because I'm very excited that it finally worked out that we could talk together because I have somebody whose scholarship I have admired for a long time with me today, which is Lou Perez or Luis Perez. Um, he is a professor of history, the J. Carlisle Sitterson Professor to be exact, at UNC Chapel Hill. He has a PhD in history from the University of New Mexico, and he is the author of, I'll just say, a lot of books. There's quite a number. My personal introduction was the book on the War of 1898, but he also has written extensively on Cuba and Cuban history, such as Cuba between Reform and Revolution, Cuba and the American Imagination, On Becoming Cuban, and Rice in the Time of Sugar, the political economy of food in Cuba. So an extensive publication record. And today we're going to talk about a book published by Duke University Press, which is Colonial Reckoning, Race and Revolution in 19th Century Cuba. So, Louis, thank you so much for taking the time today to chat. And it's so great that it finally worked out that we could do this.
I am delighted and I appreciate the invitation to join you.
Thank you. So, your entire career has been Cuban history. So tell us a little about how did you get hooked on that?
I think, like many millions of other people, the events of 1958, 1959, with the triumph of the Cuban Revolution,
Mm,
I think folks who are paying attention to the world, folks who are attentive to political change, were experienced that year, especially in 1959, and the year or two that followed immediately, as a moment of a watershed history,
mm,
where a dramatic revolution um, seized power and overturned the world as it was known in Cuba and projected a presence of this small island
mm,
that eventually joins, that's directly in the middle of the Cold War,
mm,
and produces personalities like Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara that have kind of international resonance. And
mm.
I am often asked why I got interested in this, and my usual response is, how come everybody's not interested in this? Because it's a remarkable history.
No, I agree. But considering the events that you just talked about, Cuba has been, especially from the United States side, extremely isolated. So how do you do your research? Like, do you find it easy to get into Cuba to do research, or do you do most of it from the United States?
Um, Research in Cuba is often problematical.
Mm,
Very often, access to Cuba and Cuban research repositories, that is, archives, libraries, museums, institutes, often is a function of the current state of relations between the United States and Cuba.
mm,
And this goes on both sides.
mhm,
There's a license to travel to Cuba from the US and visas to enter Cuba from the
mm,
Cuban side are often contingent on the nature of bilateral
mm,
relations. Um, in terms of Cuba, I leave from the U.S. under the general license of an academic doing
mm,
research, and in Cuba, I gain access through various institutions that
mm.
sponsor my travel and research on the island.
Ah, cool. And like, what's the state of the archive since we're on it? Is it like, are they in good shape? Are they kind of? Is there like a lot of damages that you're seeing? Are they well maintained? Just out of curiosity, because I don't think a lot of people know about what what's the situation in Cuba is in that regard.
The National Archives are in reasonably good condition. They slowly have been modernizing, digitizing. Um,
Hmm.
but the archives, all the archives, and especially the
Mm.
provincial archives, which contain fabulous and often phenomenal materials going
Mm.
back to the 18th century,
Oh,
are in terrible conditions.
okay.
They suffer. They generally suffer the fate of the island and the Cuban people. That is to say, uh, the archives, I imagine, will not, provincial archives are not going to claim high priority in matters of
Mm.
sustenance and health care and food.
Right.
So they kind of operate, with very limited resources, very limited access to support. And most of these provincial archives and municipal archives have very little climate control. And so records tend to begin to deteriorate. And then you add an occasional hurricane every now and then. And so it creates very sad conditions.
Right. Yeah. No, that's I know somebody I knew that went to the Haitian archives and they said that was pretty bad shapes there too. So it's um ooh. Well, I'm glad you got all the information that you need and that you have fairly easy access in for an American academic. So what this is not my first book of yours that I've read. As I said, I read your 1898 book first, and then I read Colonial Reckoning as sort of a one of your new books because you're constantly seemingly working on a book and constantly publishing books on Cuba. What I always enjoy with your work is your writing style. It is very engaging. It's very well flowing. It's accessible. Like it feels, and this sort of is the question that I want to first raise, is it feels like even though you're publishing with university presses, like you're writing for a popular audience, for a general audience.
Um, I enjoy the writing. I appreciate your comment on the writing. I confess sometimes to being slightly irked when I read a review of a book that is often praiseworthy and positive, but is silent on the issue of writing.
Mm,
And I say to myself, or to whoever who may be listening, God damn, did you not notice the writing? Do you think that just happened? Okay.
yes.
So I do very much appreciate when someone becomes aware of the writing, because that is I work at that. And so I write with, with people in mind.
Mm,
Can you pick this up? And I try to be as jargon free as possible.
hmm
Um, I have gone back and read books that I have maybe written, 25, 30 years ago. And I confess that I look at that and with frequency, I'll read passages and say, ouch, because the language, the vocabulary dates the book. These are words and phrases that were very much in vogue in 1988, 1990. And if you read them in 2025, you get a sense that the language dates the book, okay?
mm,
And 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 there's something about the writing that one does not wish one writing to be dated by the vocabulary that one deploys. But it happens. I guess we can't escape the times in which we live.
Never thought of that. That's so fascinating that you actually pick that up. Yeah, I've never thought of that kind of like I mean I know like like there's this university in Iowa, right, that publishes every year of like what your students are kind of like grew up in with and what they kind of know. And I guess your books are kind of like an compass to that too.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's and we follow, the academy has
Mhm.
fads in fashion, okay,
Right.
and you read something that I wrote about, you read someone writing about modernization, okay,
Hmm.
and which was all the vogue in the 1970s and 80s, or dependency theory, that was all the
Hmm.
vogue in the 80s and 90s. And one allows those winds to drive your sail, right? And so,
Hmm.
and you look at it 25 years later, and you say, "Ooh, wow! I was so easily seduced by the Vogue, and the vibe of the time." Um, and so there's something, and I don't know how one transcends it. Like I said, I don't think we could escape our culture and escape the times in which we live, and
Right.
we use the concepts and the phrases and the language that is most available to us. Because if you're going to reach a reading public, one kind of incorporates oneself into the language that is
Mhm.
in use.
Yeah.
And a generation later looks at that language and says, what the hell is this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's like, and we grow as writers. That's always the nature too
Absolutely.
of that. We
Absolutely.
we we improve, we get better, we kind of figure out what we did wrong in
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
past writing. Um, so like, do you think of like popular readers, or do you think more of like academic readers when you write your books? Like, do you kind of want to
I,
reach broader public?
of course, that one would, I don't think anybody who writes
Hmm.
would wish to limit the scope of the reading public. Um, I write with people in mind, and then I write until I can no longer edit what I have written.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
and I really try real hard not to read anything that's published because I can't change it. And
Mm,
so I could do, the phrase is there's no such thing as good writing, it's only good
mm,
rewriting. And
yeah.
so as long as when I read and I continue to make changes and edits,
Mm,
and then finally comes the point that what I'm changing is a comma, okay, then I
right.
know that I'm done. I have nothing more to say. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
And so there is a presumption of having time to do that, and I do have that time. I
Mm,
deadlines are a bane because you're rushed. Um, but given the time, I will work on something or chapters or a book or an article or a book review until I find no other changes to make in
wow. You have very patient editors.
it.
Maybe I have to publish with Duke Press then. That's um but yeah, I really enjoy the like you and it's not just the words, it's also the way you are able to bring these characters that you write about alive. And I remember in the 1898 book, you weave just the history of the event with the historiography so beautifully together. It was a beautifully flowing chapter that just um they were that you were like, wow,
Well,
I wish
thank
I
you.
could do
Thank you.
that.
Thank you. Like I said, it's very gratifying to know that the writing
Yeah.
is appreciated. Yes.
Yeah. And so are you like when you do your books, do you look for like personal stories? Do you kind of want to find like individuals to kind of illustrate what you're saying? Or are you just if a story appears, it's great, but it's not essential.
Um, Very often, what I'm doing, I have an idea, and the idea for Colonial Reckoning was to understand that the conventions of the historiography of the Cuban 19th century,
Hmm.
which is very much a kind of good guys, bad guys.
Hmm.
It's a heroic struggle in which all
Hmm.
good Cubans were arrayed on one side and all bad Cubans and Spanish were on the other side.
Hmm.
Um, it is a paradigm that I've worked with, that I have used, that I have deployed, that I have contributed to
Mm.
the years. And I think the book begins, if I recall correctly, the book begins with an anecdote being at a baseball game in Cuba, in Havana, with a dear colleague of mine,
Yes,
and
that's
uh,
where to start.
yeah, and I remember vividly that the hometown fans, there was somebody rooting for the other team, and the people around him kept denouncing him as a gorilla.
Mm.
And I turned to this friend of mine. I said, "Yeah, because in the context of gorilla means, the heroic guerrilla Che Guevara, guerrilla warfare, Fidel Castro,
Mhm.
all this thing, the mystique and the mystery of,
Right.
guerrilla warfare, of armed struggle. And here someone was being denounced as a guerrilla.
Right.
And I turned to this friend of mine and I said, what's this about? It's just like so weird. And he gave me, 30-second rundown. Okay. And that just stuck with me. Okay. That just really just and so as it's like a little an idea that just takes hold and you think about it and you think about it and you think about it and from that idea you begin to like a dark room that begins
Mhm.
to light and then you begin to see the physiognomy of the room and you say, oh, look how interesting, look at that, and all of a sudden you realize as you get deeper into your thoughts that you say, maybe this paradigm that we've used about the Cuban liberation struggle is not as black and white as we thought it was.
Right. No, and it's ironic that you're not the first person that starts the book with a baseball. You're the second one that has that actually done. But it it's also interesting because what you're doing in that, which I really enjoy too about it, that you're looking at the history to untangle the memories and the myths that exist about this kind of liberation struggle in Cuba from the 1860s to the 1890s,
Hmm.
and how Cubans kind of remember it and remember it very differently than the reality was.
Yeah, and it opens up interesting, lines of inquiry into matters
Mm,
of memory and myths, of how do we choose to remember ourselves and our history?
mhm,
How do we wish to represent ourselves? And I think all cultures, all peoples will choose to remember themselves in ways that are most flattering, that are most ingratiating.
mhm,
And there's nothing inherently wrong with that or inherently,
right,
incomprehensible about that. It's just sometimes it's necessary to, take a deep dive and say, let's revisit and let's review, and just so we don't get carried away with our own myths. Like let's put a break on this. Let's stop and pause
mhm,
to understand what happened. And some people buy into it, and many
mhm,
people would choose to remain with the myths. It's a much more
right.
congenial way of living one's national experience.
Yeah. And that's a significant part of your book was colonial reckoning, that sort of this what what is Cuba, right? Of like I always am using Benedict Anderson with sort of the imagined community as an approach when I think of nationalism, and your book strikes me as very much in line with that, in that it's sort of like you have Cubans on different sides here trying to imagine what does it mean to be Cuban? What does it mean to be part of the Cuban community?
Right, right. And that gets profoundly intersected with matters of race.
Mhm,
I mean, one of the themes that drew my attention in the reading of the period, the press, the correspondence, the diaries, the official communications, that world of what we call historians call primary sources. Okay, um, is the presence of fear. Okay, there is a and you begin to again, you sort of it's kaleidoscopic. You turn it, and all of a sudden you see something that you never saw before, and all of a sudden you come to see fear, fear, fear. Okay, there's a fear. There are fear of blacks in 19th century by whites. Whites live in varying degrees in fear of race war, the specter of Haiti, okay, looms large over the 19th century. And Haiti's become this metaphor for the end of civilization. Um, and and the Cubans, who are the direct beneficiary of the Haitian Revolution because of the stimulus that the Haitian Revolution gives to Cuban sugar production, but then experiences this extraordinary importation of enslaved men and women from Africa. So that by close to the mid 19th century, the white population on the island is a minority population. Um, and that creates the kind of context that if one is not aware of it, it's easy to ignore because it is in many ways palpable. Once you recognize it, then it's everywhere. Uh,
Mm,
and then if you take that theme of fear and you make that one of the axes, okay, that you're going to follow through the 19th century, so much more becomes comprehensible, including the U.S. intervention in 1898. This is one can make the argument that the U.S. intervention in 1898 is precisely to prevent the emergence of another Black republic in the Caribbean. And it's not a difficult argument to make. Okay? And there's enough evidence to suggest that U.S. policymakers who deemed Cuba of profound strategic importance, okay, could not bear to, to contemplate a Black republic in Cuba. Uh, with the assumption is that the revolutionary forces of the liberation movement were Black.
right. Yeah, it goes so when you think of it, it goes very counter to what most U.S. historians would like the War of 1898 to look like, right? Or
Exactly.
the it would take away from the U.S. as a good guy in
Right.
in
Yeah,
the
I don't, and this is the theme of the 1898 book that I continue to come back to again and again and again.
Mhm,
I remain puzzled by the inability of U.S. historiography
mhm,
to come to terms with the War of 1898 as a war for colonial possessions.
mhm.
Straight out,
Yeah,
straight out. Okay. I mean,
yeah,
there's nothing in my mind, there's nothing complicated about this. And that doesn't is difficult to reconcile with the concept of American exceptionalism
mhm,
uh, that is difficult to contemplate for many historians, not all, of course, but for many historians to contemplate the possibility that the U.S. engaged what is called, quote unquote, a war of choice.
mhm,
Okay. And they puzzle, why did the U.S. get into a war of choice? Well, the answer is simple, to seize colonies. Okay. But that's an idea that just has not really established itself firmly in the mainstream historiography.
yeah, and I think that's sort of also the problem of vantage point, right? Where you take the vantage point of from Cuba, and one of the things that you're illustrating with this book, The Colonial Reckoning, is that when we look at it, it's a 30-year period of conflict in Cuba that starts with the 10 Years' War and ends eventually with the quote unquote liberation or colonization by the
Mhm.
United States, whichever one you want to end up on. But it's a prolonged period of conflict that the Cubans are suffering, um, and that dramatically changes the island.
Yeah, and I think it's important, and I try to drive this point home in the book because it's it's often overlooked, at least on this side of the
Hmm.
Atlantic. Um, I think that the Spanish prosecution of the war from 68 to 78 and then 79 to 80 and then 95 to 98 there is something almost, dare I say, criminal
Hmm?
of of the Spanish government, of the
Hmm.
various conservative and liberal ministries
Hmm.
to which they sacrifice, adolescent
Hmm.
conscripts,
Yeah.
and hurl them into Cuba and then later
Hmm.
the Philippines, okay, for the purposes of national honor,
Yeah.
okay. And and I and what I seek to underscore in Colonial Reckoning is indeed the Cubans suffered, and indeed the Cubans paid a dear price. But goddamn, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Spanish
Hmm.
boys,
Yeah.
okay, were turned loose in Cuba, and as I say in the book, a war against mosquitoes and malaria,
Hmm.
and they succumbed by the thousands and thousands and thousands, and the record is painfully and palpably clear of the cost of to Spanish life,
Hmm.
let's hold off on the side of the Cuban life, in the reconcentration camps. Yes, yes, we know much about that. What is not given attention is and what the Spanish government said, to the last man, to the last peseta, like you say, damn, this is criminal, just and they come back as broken young men, if they come back at all. I
Hmm.
mean, and I am persuaded, and I am not a scholar of Spanish history, but that the roots of the Spanish Civil War of 1936, okay, are to be found, among other places, in what
Hmm.
happened in Cuba.
Hmm.
I don't know what the command structure of the Cuban army is, but I've got to believe that the Spanish young officers who were captains and majors in Cuba in 1895, 98, I think are present in 1936, 1939.
Hmm. Yeah, sort of like carrying that trauma with them and kind of wanting change.
Mm-hmm,
That
mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, it would make total sense. That is a extremely rough experience that they had in the colonies.
Yeah, yeah.
And it it does remind me though, because one of the things that you have, I think we'll start with the word choice because I really found some of the word choices that you made in the book really interesting because A, you call it a 30 Years War, which
Mm-hmm,
is a really interesting concept, but you're also talking about it as sort of a secession conflict that is taking place here. Sort of like it's not it's an independence conflict, but it's also secession away from Spain.
mm-hmm.
So why did you pick that word? Why did you think that was the most appropriate way to describe what the Cubans are doing?
I think part of it is the way the Spanish saw it. Okay, the Spanish see
Hmm.
this, they see Cuba as properly, not only patrimonio, but they see Cuba as much a part of Spain as Granada or Galicia. That this is Spanish territory, and and in that level, it is perhaps, if you accept it as a premise, it is not dissimilar to the U.S. Civil War.
Hmm.
That is a determination of the Union of the North not to allow the South to secede. Um, and Sherman's campaign, in the South was every bit as frightful as the Spanish campaign under General Weyler. Um, so there is this idea that this is national territory,
Hmm.
uh, and the idea, and then you infuse in this, and then you incorporate in this idea of that the national territory is being challenged and being perhaps dismembered by this ragamuffin army of blacks and mulattoes, okay, whose efforts seem to elude, the largest army that Spain had assembled in the New World. I mean, if you think of the 10 Years' War, 68 to 78, that lasted longer than the wars in South America. It
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
uh, and the determination, and what blew me away when I was doing the research is to think but they fought for 10 years, 68 to 78. And then they did it all over again in 95, 98. And I'm thinking, what? How do you do it twice? How do you do it twice? With the same consequences to human life, to Spanish human life.
Yeah,
Okay.
the same veracity of the fighting, right? That
Yes,
you're throwing in there.
absolutely. It is. And Whaley gets to Cuba in 1896, and he is ferocious. He is,
Mm,
there was a point where the Spanish effort was to protect sugar production and the property owning classes. When Whaley gets to Cuba, this is not about the Cuban property owning classes. This is about it's national honor,
yeah.
and there's no cost too great, no sacrifice too large
Mhm.
to defend Spanish honor. Um,
That's
you
a
know, I
very
was
dangerous concept.
no. I was years ago. I was with colleagues of mine in Havana, and there was a reception
Mm,
at the Spanish embassy, and it occurred to me, and I sat to discussion with colleagues, and I said, given the brutality of the Spanish pacification efforts under Huela in the reconcentration camps, where we don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people, mostly men, women, elderly men, women, and children, perished. I asked this colleague of mine, I said, has Spain ever apologized to Cuba? You know, in days where we apologize for our past sins, that's a thing. Nations apologize for past wrongs.
oh, oh,
And I don't think Spain has.
okay. All right. Well, overdue Spain. You got some apologies to make there. Um, but it's an interesting part where you said that it's a longer conflict than the colonial conflicts for liberation in on the continent.
Hmm.
And I mean, I've just taught my students about the Colombian independence struggle. And one thing that I always stuck by was when you look at Mexico, the campaign by the United States into it, or Napoleon's inva intervention, or you look at the kind of internal conflicts in like Colombia or Peru or Argentina in the 50s and 60s. Like the size of these armies is just so small, like 10, 15,000 maybe that are
Hmm.
fighting. And then you look at Cuba and it's like thousands, hundreds of like 100,000 troops being
Yeah,
deployed
yeah,
here.
yeah.
So
And that
it,
doesn't, excuse me, that doesn't take into consideration the Filipino insurrection, okay, where
right.
you're fighting two colonial wars at the same time. And I think the Spanish population was at the time 18, 20 million people. And for a measurement of some kind of measure comparison, I think the U.S. had in Vietnam, I don't know, 200, 300, 400,000 troops for a
Mm,
population of 200 million, and the Spanish maintained an army close to that size with a population of 18 million,
hmm.
many of whom never returned.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge commitment.
Yeah, yeah.
But the other part, it's so different from the other colonial conflicts of this period in the region. Like it's massive in scale.
Hmm.
So I do wonder, what's your thought on, is this commitment by the Spanish, especially to Cuba, and the willingness to put that much manpower into Cuba part of because that's the only thing they have left of their American empire?
That's an interesting question. It's hard for me to that's possible. I think I am more inclined to believe in this refusal uh, to accept
Mm,
dismemberment of the nation. Okay, because
mm,
what's interesting is that both the Spanish
right.
and the Cubans are fighting for some idea of nation,
Mm,
and the ferocity of the Spanish determination to defend, their version of nation
mm,
is more than adequately matched by the Cuban determination
mm,
to claim its nation. And I think what we're really looking at is really a conflict of ferocities. Okay, there
mm,
is this. If you take a look at if you read the speeches and the correspondence and the the proclamations of the Cubans during the second half of the 19th century, there's a real, for the want of a better term, a real kamikaze, determination, that they will endure what needs to be
mm,
endured. And I've read the correspondence and the speeches of people that if it means that Cuba is reduced to ashes and to rubble,
mm,
in pursuit of nation, well, so be it, and they will reconcile themselves. And again, that's a line, that line, and Jose Marti is very clear on this. That line is straight and direct to Fidel Castro and the Cubans of today.
mm,
Okay, that the issue of national sovereignty and self-determination, if it you know if it there's a speech that Fidel gave in the 1980s where he says, if it means that we have to live in caves the way our ancestors did, okay, we will return to live in caves, okay. And the people who look at that as the people who look at that speech and say these are the rantings of a madman, okay.
mm,
First blush, you say, maybe, but if you take a look at the speeches that were made by Jose Marti and the Cuban leaders of the Wars for
mhm.
Independence, they're saying the same thing,
Yeah, yeah, I do.
exact same thing.
Hmm. No, it's incredible, right? But it's also incredible when you think of like the, I guess, lack of consideration for human lives in that, that they're literally like, be it on the Spanish side with the extermin with the concentration camps, or be it on the Cuban side with some of the guerrilla tactics that they are employing, they're they're fighting life and death. They're willing to like there's no gray area in there, it feels like.
I think that speaks to the power of an idea,
Mm,
the power of, if you are persuaded that you are defending civilization, okay, that you are the last and best defense of civilization and you cannot fail, then it seems to provide the kind of moral authority to take whatever measures when necessary
mm,
to defend civilization.
mhm,
Because you fail, then it's the end. It's the end of the world. I just um, and we have too many examples of this over the last 100 years, 200 years, and we're living it now. In many places of the world where human life seems to be a very, very cheap commodity.
I think a lot of Russian soldiers are experiencing that, unfortunately, these
Hmm.
days. But one thing, like, sort of to before we move on into sort of more of the military, what tell us a little about the military situation because we have obviously we have the Spanish army and we have the Cuban rebels, but there's also a lot of other, couple of other groups that are of importance here.
Yeah, we have if we kind of prepare a list, okay,
Doesn't
we
have to
have,
be that detailed.
yeah, no, but I think it's just that there are three or four categories of that bear mention. There are in the Spanish side we have the regular Spanish Army and I'm sure and Navy, okay, and the Spanish and the police, but the Army and the Navy, and followed by or joined with the voluntarios. And the voluntarios are Spanish residents of Cuba who organize into these militias. And rank is often accorded to people of property. The more property you own, the higher the rank. And often you recruit your own employees or your own workers, and you become this kind of urban guard to allow the Spanish army to conduct field operations. Uh, and then you have the last group are the guerrillas.
Mm,
And the guerrillas are what really drew me to this project in the first place. And these are Cubans. And when I say Cuban, criollos, um, possibly in the majority black, but that's not for certain, who are recruited and organized as in today's lexicon we would call as counterinsurgents.
mhm,
That is to say, they will adopt the methods and means of conducting war of the Cuban insurgents. They are Many of them may be ex-insurgents.
mhm,
Many of them are people who have been, certainly in 95, 98, people who have been pulled into the countryside and out of the countryside to the cities
mhm,
to in the reconcentration camps, and are doing nothing more than finding a way of means of livelihood and sustenance to support their family. And so they're receiving pay in the service of the Spanish government. So these are the three main blocks on the on the Spanish side. And the Cuban side, you have, the insurgency, the Liberation Army, that has a fairly well-defined command structure, supported by the Cuban emigre community,
mhm,
mostly in the United States, but also in Central America and other Caribbean islands, um, that provide resources and funding and material to support the war. And then I guess the Cuban rural population, which is the people who provide, the support and the intelligence and the
mhm,
medicine and the food. And then the most important ally of the Cuban insurgent is a damn mosquito, okay, that flies across enemy
mhm,
lines, spreading yellow fever and malaria.
mhm.
You know, And I've said often that the unsung hero of the Cuban independence movement is the mosquito, okay, and the rainy season, okay,
Mhm.
the description, the first person descriptions we have from the Spanish soldiers of the Spanish army of campaigning in Cuba makes grim reading. It is just bleak, bleak, bleak.
Right.
Um, and in point of fact, the guerrillas are conducting, as all guerrillas operate, I'm sorry, the Cubans are conducting a war that has been since the Spanish resisted Napoleon.
Mhm,
With a very simple principle, that is that the guerrillas do not have to win. All they have to
mhm,
do is make certain they don't lose, because what they're doing is, conducting, sporadic military operations for political purposes. And basically, the idea is to wither the morale and the political will
mhm.
of the opposition to finally say, the hell with this, we're done. Yeah.
Yeah, they tried hard. And it seemed also that, I mean, you mentioned the rainy season and the mosquitoes, but it also seems like the environment with the forests, the kind of dense growth
Hmm.
in parts of Cuba is extremely helpful to conducting a guerrilla campaign, and that you can blend in and suddenly appear and attack the enemy, and it's in a most vulnerable of states.
Yes, I have in the book, I have several illustrations that depict what was called the Manigua, that is the interior of eastern Cuba, uh, and the idea that you have to supply your 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 forces from the coast and what they call these expeditions,
Mhm,
long lines of expeditions. And I have a couple of illustrations of pack animals, pack mules, carrying supplies in single lines, and you know always susceptible to ambush, always susceptible to attack, because the guerrilla never initiates combat until and unless it enjoys favorable advantage. You know, and these convoys, as they were known from the coast into the interior, were absolutely indispensable and absolutely vulnerable.
well, and great targets, right?
Yes,
Small number of troops
yeah,
guarding along a drawn out line. It's you hit part of it, and you can make away with a lot of food for your own side.
right,
So
absolutely.
and but it's also the kind of challenge that any country that faces a guerrilla war fa has to deal with of like how do you fight an elusive enemy that hides in the forest and blends into the civilian population?
With great difficulty, with
Yeah.
great difficulty, you know, the too many, not all succeed, of course,
Mm,
but many do, and it's just it is the degree to which people are willing. I think that, as I said, I think guerrilla wars are something especially ferocious about guerrilla war, and especially when the guerrilla wars take the form of national liberation struggles, because
mhm,
and then you have a whole different, it's an indigenous uprising against a foreign colonizer, and there's no such thing as innocent bystanders.
mhm.
Okay, I had interesting conversations with students about the Algerian war against the
Yeah.
Algerian liberation movement, and the discussion about, are is a restaurant made of patronized by French civilians, men and women, a legitimate target.
Mm,
Uh, okay, and that's how desperate wars of this, how desperate the turn they take in wars of
mm.
this type.
Yeah, and I mean we see it with the Spanish, right? With the exterminate or almost extermination policy that they're embracing with parts of Cuba.
Hmm.
That said, so we're kind of for geographical purposes, we're not talking about a conflict that encompasses all of Cuba either, right?
That's right, right, right. By 1890, by the end of 1896, the war goes from one end of the island to the other. The great
Hmm.
the great breakthrough is in the end of 1895, early 1896, when the insurgent armies finally reach the western end of the island, and now where the Spanish had been successful, mostly successful in containing the insurgency in the 10 Years' War to the eastern provinces.
Hmm.
By 1906, they had broken out of the east and began to conduct operations in western Cuba. And again, what the tactics were really um, to bring the Cuban economy to a halt. Okay,
Hmm.
that was one of the principal tactics, and the Cubans speak of the torch,
Hmm.
and so you have an anomalous situation if you kind of pull back, where the Cubans are waging war on the economy and the
Hmm.
Spanish are waging war against the Pacific population.
Hmm.
Okay? And there are comparatively few major battles in
Hmm.
this war. Okay, this is
Did
not,
they
this is,
fight any battles?
there are several battles,
Okay.
noteworthy battles in which the Cubans inflict unexpectedly serious
Mm.
damage in the Spanish army.
Okay.
Um, but guerrilla warfare is not known for battles until the very end, when finally it comes down to
Mm.
the final scenes of the war.
Oh yeah, and I remember the kind of vivid detail of like that you have where like um the change of the military sinking and on the Cuban side was 1895 and they're attacking the plantations heading towards Savannah and the plantation owners are just fleeing because
Right,
it's like
right.
everything seems to be burning.
Yeah, I mean what's fascinating is that one of the reasons that the Cuban army is successful in moving across the full extent of the island in late 95, early 96, is that the Governor General Martinez Campos was following the historic playbook of Spain and Cuba, which was to
Mm.
protect property. Okay,
Mm. Right.
because it was necessary historically and culturally, and economically, for the Spanish government to retain the support of the property owning classes.
Mm.
I mean, that's how colonialism survived in Cuba to begin with. Um, and so Martinez Campos, followed that playbook, and took a vast portion of the available soldiers that he had and deployed them to protect sugar.
Mm,
And I don't want to say it gives the Cubans a free pass, but it certainly facilitates the Cubans' march across the island. And that's where when Whaler comes in, he tells the Cuban planter class, you're on your own. I'm not here to defend
mm,
property. I'm here to defend the honor of Spain. So if they burn out all your sugar estates, okay,
mm,
that's not my problem. Okay, so the character of the war changes
mm,
when Whaley gets to Cuba, and he makes it abundantly clear that he
mm.
is not there to protect property. He's there to defend Spain.
Well, it's also the kind of I think it. I'm not sure it was in the 10 Years' War and the Independence War in '95, but I remember you had one aspect where they kind of tried to draw sort of like a fortification line through the island
Yeah,
as sort of like
yeah,
this is we're gonna stop them right here, and it's sort of like it is like it reminds me of like the Argentinians do that against the native population. Like I mean, we're built doing it in the U.S. with that Mex wall against Mexico, and it's like it's so many times tried, but it never works against guerrilla fighters.
yeah. I mean, it did contain the trocha, which contains like the narrowest point of the island,
Mm,
where this fortified ditch, with outposts and blockhouses.
mm,
And in the 10 Years' War, they did cross over it. Okay, from
mm,
time to time, they made incursions into the west. But again, the idea was it was okay to contain this
mm,
insurgency in the east, which was relatively speaking without the property production value
mm,
of the sugar estates. It was at all costs to protect the sugar estates in western Cuba.
mm,
And by and large, they were successful. They just couldn't, the Cuban insurgents could not summon or sustain
mm,
operations across the Trocha
mm.
until 95, 96, and when they just broke right through it with impunity.
So when we think of Cuba, the eastern half is less developed than the western half, and the wealth is sort of there's a wealth disparity in there.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It demographically is different. The population is different. The
Yeah.
economy is different. So most of Cuba's wealth are really the four western provinces, which is sugar,
Mm.
coffee, and tobacco. Yeah,
Oh, wow. And so would that would then also be where the high concentration of the enslaved population would be
absolutely,
located.
absolutely,
So
right.
you wouldn't have as much of a slave population in the eastern part of the
No,
island.
the eastern part of Cuba was far more had articulated, far more anti-slavery
Mm.
politics.
That
Uh,
makes sense.
yeah, yeah, and it was a population of far larger free people of color,
Mm. Okay.
a population far larger in terms of property owning, small
Mm.
farms, small estates. Not that there were not sugar estates, there were
Right.
large sugar estates, of course, uh, but it was technologically backward. It was off the
Mm.
beaten path. It didn't have access to the markets of the West. You know,
I
the city
assume a
of
lack of
Santiago.
infrastructure too, right? That
Right, right,
uh,
right. They did not have the railroads, the technology.
mm,
So it's a the very concept of when the Cubans cross into the West, the concept they use is the invasion.
mm,
And just pause on that. You figure, well, what does that concept, what does
mm,
that imagery evoke?
right.
How do you quote unquote invade your own island?
Yeah.
Unless somewhere in your mind and as
Mm,
a paradigm, you see this is a very different place,
right.
okay, on the same island.
That's that's so interesting on so many levels because I forget where or when. Like I think it was in a talk given by Ed Rugemer where he talked about like slavery post American Civil War in Brazil and Cuba and the or yeah in those two countries and sort of the emancipation that falls and how it's different from the United States because you don't have sort of that sectionalism that you have in the United States, but it sounds
Mhm.
like Cuba does have a sectionalism
Oh,
that
it
you have a
does.
very
Oh, it does.
powerful plantation economy on one side and less so on the other.
It most certainly does. Even to this day, there is a very sharp awareness of the East,
Mm,
uh, of somehow, I mean, I mean, it's complicated, and to plumb deeply into this just opens up all sorts of very interesting patterns. I mean,
Yeah.
Eastern Cuba, the city of Santiago de Cuba was the original capital, okay,
Mm.
and Santiago is very much a Caribbean city.
Okay.
And Havana is very much an Atlantic city. Havana looks
Mm.
out, to the United States, to Europe.
Mm.
It's the crossroads of the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
Um, and so you find historically the the changes that overtake Havana are very, very slow to reach Santiago, and Santiago
Mm.
changes in ways that are different from Havana.
Right.
It's a fascinating interior history
Mm.
of the island.
So that going back to your concept of fears, though, that if you have a small or almost inexistent slave population in the west, on the eastern side of the island, the Cuban insurgents aren't that then very afraid of the enslaved population rising up or that they could be stirring up trouble. It's the planters in the west that have that
Right,
great
right.
fear.
You're right. There is this sense that in the imagination of Western Cuba, again going back to fear,
Hmm.
um, the word, the term Orientales,
Hmm.
meaning people from Oriente province, was often used as the synonym for black.
Mm.
And because the leadership of the insurgent army, certainly in 10 Years' War and especially in 95, was well represented by black and mulatto officers. And so, starting in the person of Antonio Maceo, who was the second commanding general of the Liberation Army, um, the idea that you'll see that the actual word Orientalis used uh, as the panic-inducing imagery,
Right.
that the Orientales are coming, and that means the blacks are coming, and again fear that there is this panic. There is, I mean, and I am aware that I did not do justice to the 3 or 4 months from, let's say, November, December, January, October, November, December 95, and January 96, as Maceo's army crosses the island.
Mm.
I mean, that's worth a book, just those 4 months, okay? Because it is the palpable panic
Mm.
uh, that seizes the western regions, and there are
Mm.
some vivid descriptions of whites fleeing from the cities of Santa Clara or Matanzas on trains, rushing toward Havana,
Mm.
and Havana bracing for the siege of the black armies that were
Right.
going to descend on it. I mean, there's real, there, I don't know how to say this, but panic writ large.
Yeah.
That the end of civilization was imminent.
Right. How just because I'm more in also in tune with the early 19th century, how much does that still have that ring from like the Haitian Revolution in it? So
Oh no, it's
definitely.
the embers of the Haitian Revolution still still capable of flaring up.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a huge impact. That like sometimes we forget that the Haitian Revolution has that long shadow.
Oh yeah.
Um, but with the imageries that you talked about, it's you have I don't know how many, but I remember very much three very much images from 95 in the book of like extremely racist depictions of African people, sort of like that one image where it like the African person sort of like with a vampire teeth kind of
Yeah. Right.
devouring.
Right.
It seemed reading through your book that it was especially in 95, 96 on the rise that they used that imagery, that it wasn't as strongly present in the 10 years conflict.
That's correct. And I think not that it wasn't, it was in the spoken word, in the written word.
Mm,
Um, but then again, the insurgency never escaped its containment in the 10 Years' War.
mm,
I think when the insurgency breaks out of the East and reaches the West within the first year,
mm,
um, then the Spanish begin to conduct, uh, you know, purposely, propaganda. If you had any doubts what this war was about, you just look at the Spanish propaganda
mm,
and the illustrations and the imagery that is used, just to say, just in case you've forgotten what this fake here, look at this image, okay?
mhm. Right. Yeah. Um, and staying with images, I love that you have this one image of the insurgents having derailed a train in your
Hmm.
book. And I love that because it was so much like not just that they go for the infrastructure like insurgents, they're cutting the supply lines of the and cutting into the infrastructure of the Spanish, but they take the moment to pose and take a picture, right? Like they're not worried that in 5 minutes or in 30 minutes there's going to be a Spanish army here that will fight us. They're like, no, we have the time to take a picture.
Right. I had not thought of that, but yes. Yeah, and how fortuitous that there was a photographer available.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure that guy came along because they kind of wanted the publicity, but it's also publicity part that you're
Yes,
taking these pictures to kind of show the world, look, we can do this.
yes, exactly.
That was just great. Um, Nita just throws that in. Um, right. Just keeping an eye on our time and the questions here. The considering you wrote a whole book on how the United States gets involved in this Cuban War for Independence. It in that book you already kind of downplay like the justification, how justified the United States is for getting into this. And it seemed like reading through Colonial Reckoning that it just makes zero sense whatsoever why the United States would get into this by its own proclaimed reasoning. Yeah,
Yeah, I think part of the problem of coming to an understanding about the U.S. intervention in Cuba, um, there's a school of thought that took hold in the 50s, 60s, and it's kind of permeated, insinuated itself into a large part of the historiography that the people like George Kennan, and a couple
mhm,
others of the political Cold War political thinkers, um, take a look at 1898 and
mhm,
cannot uh, see a a
mhm,
political or strategic reasons to intervene in the war in Cuba. And therefore, they need to find an explanation. So
mhm,
it's an explanation for the act of what is of a war of choice.
mhm,
Why would the United States go to war? The U.S. had no strategic interests at stake in what was going
mhm,
on in Cuba.
right,
So why would one engage in a war of choice? And because they have no explanation, they buy into the proposition of American exceptionalism,
mhm,
that American humanitarian, American sense of righteous purpose. And then once they provide that as an explanation, they then proceed to criticize humanitarian intervention as being pernicious to the national interest.
mhm,
Okay. All well and clear. If you accept the premise that it was
right,
a humanitarian intervention, then we should not be fighting wars for humanitarian intervention. We should only be fighting wars when the national interest is at stake.
mhm,
Cool. They ignored the previous 100 years of history.
mhm,
And I would contend that 1898 has a history. It does
Mhm.
not come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And so if you look back, beginning with Jefferson,
Mhm.
there was a politics and a policy that was set in place from Jefferson through McKinley, and that was that the possession of Cuba was a matter of, of strategic necessity for U.S. well-being. That the island of Cuba, as long as it's in the possession of Spain, posed no threat because Spain posed no threat. But the proposition of a free and independent Cuba was not an acceptable outcome. People who say the U.S. went to war to help Cuba win its independence are I don't know how they can document that. So the war becomes the war the U.S. war against Spain is to prevent the one outcome that had
Mhm.
threatened American strategic interest all through the 19th century, and that is Cuban independence.
Mhm.
Now, one may say, how silly. Why would they think that this, in other words, on some level, it's almost inadmissible to think that free Cuba is going to threaten the U.S. strategic interest. All well and good, but that's not how the
Mhm.
policymakers thought in the 19th century. A free and independent Cuba was a threat to American national security,
Mhm.
economic security, strategic. It's unacceptable.
Well, I
So,
also find it interesting when you think of like the whole humanitarian aspect of it, like we're intervening to save lives. Well, the Spanish are changing policies by
right,
this point,
right,
right?
right,
Like,
right. Right. And the war, I think the tipping point of the war was when the McKinley administration was able to persuade the Spanish to call a ceasefire,
mhm.
uh, and hoping that the Cubans would call a ceasefire, and then there would be some negotiated settlement. And I think, if for McKinley's purposes, uh, perhaps Spain would sell the island to the U.S. Okay. Um, the problem with McKinley's plan of a ceasefire and armistice, okay, was that the Cubans rejected it. Okay,
Mhm.
and they said they would not stop fighting, and that left the Spanish no choice. And when they reached that point, I mean, that was the point of no return. The
Mhm.
war followed. And unfortunately, historians who have availed themselves to the McKinley papers get to the McKinley papers in the Library of Congress, and they are disappointingly sparse. Okay, there's just I don't know if his records were purged or what, but I remember my first visit to McKinley's papers, so excited that I was going to find, the smoking gun, right?
And then
And
nothing.
there's nothing there. There's nothing there. I think this is a consensus of opinion of scholars who have used the McKinley papers. There's so little there.
Oh, that sucks. Well, on the other hand, good because it gives us more opportunities to talk about the other side. Um, but since you do have a hard deadline coming up here soon, I want one more question I want to pose to you is back to memory, because it's a conflict that involves Spain versus Cuban. In part, eventually involves the United States, Spain, and Cubans fighting each other. But also, there's a strong situation that there's a lot of Cubans fighting other Cubans.
Mhm.
And what I'm kind of wondering about is this is a civil war in part. And one of the big challenges after civil wars is how do you reconcile? How do you become neighbors again? How do you work with somebody who has just tried to kill you and your
Yeah,
family again?
yeah, that's a very good question. Um, there, one of the themes that emerge from the diaries and the memoirs, um, and interviews of the Mambises, that's what the Cuban insurgents were called, okay, was that, uh, where they would capture Spanish soldiers, and release them.
Mm,
Uh, when they captured Cuban guerrillas, that is, Cubans fighting for Spain,
mm,
they would be summarily executed. There would be no mercy shown. There is a dark period between the the ceasefire with Spain and the U.S. From August 12th, 1898 to, let's say, January 1st, 1899, when U.S. Officially assumed um, governing the island. So that is that space between the last month of Spanish sovereignty in Cuba,
Mm,
in which revenge killings took place across the island.
mm,
I mean,
yeah,
the Cubans who fought for Spain were hunted down and killed, in dark alleys
mm,
on rural country roads, wherever and however found.
mm,
There was a particular, a special ferocity
mm,
that was meted out to the Cubans who supported Spain. And every now and then, in the years that followed, someone who was able to conceal
mm,
their guerrilla, and I use guerrilla origins here from vis-a-vis Spain, maybe held public office, okay,
yeah,
and they were, repudiated.
mm,
So there is, and this is another story that still has to be told. The degree to which the Cubans who fought for Spain were absolutely hunted down and killed.
mm. It seems like it's almost like a theme in Cuban history, right? That you have this sort of like you're as a defeated enemy in in the independence struggle and you're hunted down. And in many ways, you have the same after Castro takes over power and a lot of Cubans
Oh yeah, yeah,
leaves
yeah.
the island to come to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, but again, I think it happens. I mean, this, we need not go too far. What happens to the Afghans who collaborated with the American army?
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
after what happens to the Vietnamese who
Hmm.
collaborated with the United States? What happens to the Algerians who collaborated with the French?
Hmm.
We know that there's a special kind of justice that's meted out to collaborators. What happened to the collaborators of Vichy France?
Hmm.
Okay, I mean just to contextualize this. I
Yes.
mean, there is a history. It's
Hmm.
one collaborators, and however you put them to the light of day,
Yeah.
do not fare well after the war is over.
Unfortunately, yes. It's it's part of human history. We don't like we like to kind of show off when we get to when we win in a very
Mhm.
brutal conflict afterwards. You know. But I do want to give you, make sure you have time to adjust before you have your next thing here at noon. But
Mhm, mhm.
Lou, I'm so glad that you took the time today and chatted for a little bit about your book. And let me just remind everyone on the book. This is with Duke University Press. It's came out in December of 23. Colonial Reckoning, Race and Revolution in 19th Century Cuba.
Well, thank you, Niels, for the invitation, and I very much enjoyed our conversation.
My pleasure.